everyone! Welcome to my channel. Always remember, ignorance of the law excuses no one. This is Legally Engineered. Hello guys! We are here again to give you another video lecture as regards our lecture series in obligations and contracts. And again, I am Attorney Bendrick A. Maralit.
And I'm Attorney April Ampuy.
And we are here today to discuss to you the different kinds of obligations. That's under Module 4. Alright, Attorney Uy, let's talk about these different kinds of obligations. So may sinasabi na iba-iba daw uri ng obligasyon. Ano ba ibig sabihin
Actually,
nito?
there are two major classifications of obligation. Yung primary classification and secondary classification. But for purposes of discussion nitong Module 4, we will just focus on the primary classifications. So we have 6 primary classification of obligation. Yung una natin is yung pure and conditional obligations, which is found in Articles 1179 to 92 of the Civil Code. Meron din tayong obligations with a period under Articles 1193 to 1198 of the Civil Code. At yung pantatlo, yung alternative and facultative obligations under Article 1199 to 1206.
And syempre meron din tayong joint and solidary obligations. That's under Article 1207 to Article 1222. We also have divisible and indivisible obligations under Articles 1223 to 1225. And lastly, obligations with a penal clause under Articles 1226 to 1230. So basically, these 6 primary classification of obligations under the Civil Code are what we are going to discuss in this video lecture and in the coming lectures that we have. So let's proceed right away to our first kind of obligation.
Yes, so our first kind of obligation is pure and conditional obligations.
Yes.
So, Article 1179 provides that every obligation whose performance does not depend upon a future or uncertain event or upon a past event unknown to the parties is demandable at once. Every obligation which contain a resolutory condition shall also be demandable without prejudice to the effects of the happening of the event.
So you've discussed, Attorney Uy, that this is about pure obligation. So I guess it's important for us to define what a pure obligation means.
Yes.
And a pure obligation is one which is not subject to any condition and no specific date is mentioned for its fulfillment and is therefore immediately demandable. So walang kondisyon, walang specific date.
Yes, and it's not subject to a period, so pure obligation. And kasi dahil nga daw pure obligation ito ay immediately demandable.
So let's give them an example, no, Attorney Uy. For example, si debtor, he obliges to pay the creditor's fee for the amount of, let's say, 1,000 pesos.
Yes, 1,000 pesos.
Then, in this case, the obligation is immediately demandable if there is no condition and no date is mentioned for its fulfillment.
Siyempre, halimbawa ako nangutang kay Attorney Maralit ng 1,000 pesos. No, it is not subject to any condition or period. Ang sabi, yun daw ay pure obligation and therefore it is immediately demandable.
Ang paano ka, Attorney Uy, kung halimbawa nangutang ako sa'yo ng 1,000 pesos and then ang agreement natin, sabi ko, Attorney Uy, uyanan mo naman ako ng 1,000 pesos, babayaran ko sa katapusan ng buwan na to, October 30 to be exact.
Yes.
Would you consider that as a pure obligation, Attorney Uy?
Hindi na. Kasi meron ng, it is subject now to a suspensive period.
Can I demand that the payment for that tomorrow, for example?
Hindi, kasi specified ang date.
So hindi siya immediately demandable?
Magiging due and demandable pa lang siya from the time na nag-arrive na yung period specified. O, kung hindi pa nag-a-arrive, hindi pa demandable.
Another example, halimbawa, si debtor. Nag-promise nga siya to pay the creditor 1,000 pesos again.
Yes.
And upon receipt by the debtor of his share from the estate of X or upon demand of the creditor.
Yes.
In this case, Attorney Uy, ano bang interpretation mo doon sa obligation na to? Would you consider that as a pure obligation?
It can also be considered as a pure obligation because yung creditor can rely on the wordings na upon demand ang sinabi. So that is also immediately demandable.
So, unang tingin mo, isipin mo, hindi siya pure no? Kasi
Oo,
parang may
subject
pinavide.
to a condition.
To condition. However, yun nga, sinabi, upon demand. So,
Yes.
immediately demandable depending on when it would be demanded.
Oo, kasi dalawa kasi yung binigay niya Yung yung isang condition, magiging due and demandable kapag nakolekta na niya yung share niya from the estate. At yung isa namang condition pa is upon demand of C. So, ibig sabihin, either
In the
of
alternative
the two.
kasi.
Yes, either
no?
of the two.
In the alternative. Or, no? Suppose, ang naging condition then is, and share from the estate of X and upon demand of C.
So, ngayon, iba na yun.
Iba na.
Ibig sabihin, dalawa na yung condition.
Kailangan makomply.
Kailangan mo makomply parehas.
Alright. Take note of that. So, again, may napapag-usapan kasi dito, Attorney Uy, na condition no? So,
Condition.
meron palang tinatawag na conditional obligation. Ano ba yung
Yes.
conditional obligation?
A conditional obligation is one whose consequences are subject in one way or another to the fulfillment of a condition. In short, obligation subject to a condition.
And what is a condition?
Yes. Yung condition is a future and uncertain event upon the happening of which the effectivity or extinguishment of an obligation or rights subject to it depends.
So, nakadepende dito sa condition na to.
But
And
keyword there is future and
uncertain.
uncertain.
So, dito makikita natin na merong requisites, requirement, no, pagdating sa, para ma-consider mo na it's a condition. First of which is yung sinabi na Attorney Uy, it must be future and uncertain, or pwede rin namang past but unknown, and must not be impossible. Kasi nga, kapag impossible naman yung condition imposed, then
May certain consequences.
yes, may certain consequences. So, take note of, guys,
For example,
na,
Attorney Meralit, how about death? Is death a condition?
in that case, death is a period.
Yes, hindi siya condition. Bakit? Kasi although future naman yung death kasi wala nakakali, pero it is certain kasi lahat tayo mamamatay.
Certain to happen. No?
Mm-mm,
So, take note of
certain.
that. Dapat uncertain. You
Yes.
don't know kung mangyayari ba or hindi yung condition na yun.
Yes.
Alright. So, take note, guys, na either mag-give rise to an obligation or
It will
ma-extinguish
extinguish.
yung
So,
obligation.
pwede ring example dyan, yung upon passing the subject Oblicon.
Is
So,
that a condition?
It's a condition because it's uncertain kung
Yes.
papasa.
So you're not certain if you will pass this
Oo.
course.
So,
that's a
that's a
condition.
condition.
Okay, gotcha. And napapag-usapan na rin naman natin yung condition kasi sabi ko nga kanina, pag nangyari yung condition, Attorney Uy, either mag-give rise yan sa isang obligasyon or yung existing obligation ay
It will cause the
ma-extinguish
extinguishment.
or mawala.
Yes.
So, ibig sabihin, pwedeng either or. And therefore, there are two principal kinds of condition.
Yes.
Ano ba yan?
So, ito yung suspensive condition at saka yung resolutory condition. So, yung suspensive condition, it is one the fulfillment of which will give rise to an obligation or right. The demandability of the obligation is suspended until the happening of the condition.
So, you cannot demand the fulfillment of the obligation unless the
Yes.
condition
Has been fulfilled.
So,
Oo.
bigyan natin yan ng example. Halimbawa, guys, ito yung obligation na meron tayo. Sabi ko, I will give Attorney Uy 10,000 pesos if she would pass the bar exams.
Exam, oo.
Yan, ang bar
Kunyari,
exam.
hindi pa ako nakatapos,
Halimbawa,
ah.
kasi lawyer na si Attorney
Oo.
Uy ngayon. Halimbawa, di pa siya pumapasa, mag-delay siya ng bar exam. Sabi ko, sige, April, I'll be giving you 10,000 pesos if you will pass the 2021 bar examination.
Oo, 2021 bar examination. So, ganun.
So, in that
Kinabukasan ba, pwede na ako mag-demand kay Attorney Maralit na, Attorney, nasa na yung 10,000 ko? Sabi mo, bibigyan mo ko. The answer is
hindi
no.
pa. Sabi nga natin kanina, it will only give rise to the demandability of the
The
obligation
obligation.
once ma-fulfill.
Fulfill.
Okay.
Yung, kung kailan, makapasa ka muna.
Oo.
Makapasa muna ako sa bar exam bago ako makapag-demand ng 10,000 pesos from Attorney Maralit.
So, halimbawa, suppose, Attorney Uy, dumating ang 2021 bar examination, you took the bar exam and unfortunately you flunked the bar, you were not able to
Oo,
pass,
I was not
would you have the
able.
right to demand from me the 10,000 pesos?
Hindi,
Hindi.
wala na, hindi ma hindi.
Hindi
Oo,
aaser.
hindi na. Hindi na.
Hindi. Kasi hindi na fulfill yung
Yan nga,
condition.
sabi din, if the suspensive condition does not take place, the parties would stand as if the conditional obligation had never existed. So, for me, kung di ako nakapasa ng 2021 bar examination, sorry na lang.
And in that case, I won't be liable to give her 10,000 pesos
10,000.
because the suspensive condition, which
Did
is
not
to
take
pass the
place.
2021 bar examination, did not take place. Now, kung meron tayong suspensive condition, yung napag-usapan natin kanina, meron yun yung opposite naman.
Yes,
Ano
yung
yun?
opposite naman ito, yung resolutory condition.
Mhm.
One, the fulfillment of which will extinguish an obligation or right already existing. So,
Mhm.
ibig sabihin, the obligation is already due and demandable, pero the happening of the condition will extinguish or terminate the obligation or the right acquired by virtue of that obligation.
Yeah. So this is a condition subsequent. Existing na nga ang
Yes.
obligation, pwedeng ma-extinguish kapag nangyari yung condition. So for example, sabi ko naman, attorney, uy, ganun ulit. Sabi ko sa'yo, April, I'll be giving you 10,000 pesos monthly allowance until you graduate from college. In that case, yung bang aking obligation to you is immediately demandable or magiging demandable lang kapag graduate ka ng college?
It is immediately demandable kasi resolutory condition na yung
Mhm.
upon or resolutory condition na yung until I graduate from college. Ibig sabihin, kapag nakagraduate na ako, no more obligation on the part of Attorney Marali to give me 10,000 pesos monthly allowance.
So ito,
Kabaliktaran naman.
yes, this will extinguish my existing obligation. So what is my existing obligation? To give her 10,000 pesos monthly allowance. Pero pag graduate na si Attorney Uy, extinguish na ang obligation ko to give her 10,000
Yes.
pesos na monthly allowance.
Yeah, so for example, ngayon, sinabi mo October 1 ngayon, sabi mo bibigyan mo ako ng 10,000 monthly allowance, tapos until makagraduate ako ng college. So ngayon o kaya bukas o kaya mamaya, I can demand the 10,000 monthly allowance.
Immediately demandable.
Oo, immediately demandable siya.
Okay. Take note of that, resolutory and suspensive condition. Now, since napapag-usapan naman natin yung obligations that are demandable at once, kailan ba demandable at once ang isang obligation?
Yeah. So, una, when it is pure,
Yun na yung
kanina
na-establish
sinabi
natin ngayon.
kanina,
Pure.
ulit yung pure, not subject to any condition or to any period.
Mhm.
Tapos yung padalo, when it is subject to resolutory condition.
Mhm.
And yung pantatlo, when it is subject to a resolutory period.
Which we will discuss under Article 1193 of the Civil Code later on. So, that's for 1179. Now, let's proceed to 1180. In Article 1180, guys, it states that when the debtor binds himself to pay, when his means permit him to do so, then the obligation shall be deemed to be one with a period subject to the provisions of Article 1197. So, pwede naman kasi talagang mangyari no, na halimbawa babayaran kita kapag kaya ko nang magbayad
Bayad,
or meron na akong pambayad sa iyo, pang-uyan sa iyo. In that case, pasok 'yon sa Article 1180. Ito yung where duration of period depends upon the will of the debtor. Okay. Pero bago natin yung pag-usapan, kanina kasi may napag-usapang kondisyon. Ngayon, may period
Yes.
na sinasabi. Ano ba tong period na to, Attorney Uy, at anong kinaibahan nito sa kondisyon?
Yes. A period is a future and certain event
Mhm.
upon the arrival of which the obligation subject to it either arises or is extinguished. So, kaibahan nito dun sa condition, yung condition kanina, it's future and uncertain. Ito namang period, it is future and certain to happen. Period. Halimbawa,
Death.
January, death. That's a period.
Mhm.
At saka yung mga dates natin, January 31. January 31, 2021.
That's future, but it is certain to happen.
Certain to happen.
Okay. So, ngayon, since na-discuss natin yung period na yan, in relation to that, we need to know kailan ba nangyayari na yung duration of period
Is-
solely depends upon the will of the
debtor.
So, there are
Kasi nga
different
sabi
cases.
sa 1180, yun nga, the obligation shall be deemed to be one with a period,
Kapag
even if the duration depends upon the will of the debtor. So, paano natin masasabi na nga na yung duration depends upon the will of the debtor?
So, first case natin dyan is, of course, when the debtor promises to pay when his means permit him to do so, which is exactly what is incorporated under Article 1180. Kapag sinabi ng debtor na magbabayad ako or i-deliver ko sa'yo, i-fulfill ko yung obligation kapag kaya ko na or when my means permit me to do so, then in that case, that obligation shall be deemed to be one with a period.
Ang nakalagay pa dyan, what is left only to his will is the duration of the period. So, ibig sabihin, sure na magbabayad siya, pero yung duration lang ng yung period is hindi mo alam kung kailan.
Kasi later on we'll find out na kapag yung obligation solely depends, the fulfillment of the obligation solely depends upon the will of the debtor, then that is not a valid obligation. Pero in this case, nililinaw lang namin na valid ito kasi what is solely left on the will of the debtor is the duration of the period, not necessarily the fulfillment of the obligation. Kasi magbabayad naman
kasi sure na magbabayad.
Yes. Are there any other cases, Attorney Uy, wherein we can say that the duration of a period depends upon the will of the debtor and still can be considered as one with a period?
Yung I will as when the debtor binds himself to pay little by little,
paunti-unti, babayaran kita paunti-unti.
At least may initiative na magbayad. As soon as possible.
Yan, nakakatakot yung as soon as possible.
Parang indefinite.
Indefinite, pero again, sabi dito, this still would be considered as
one with a period.
One with a period,
Should be deemed to be one with a period. From time to time, mayat-mayat.
As soon as I have the money, pag may pera na ako,
at any time I have money in partial payments when I am in the position to pay. Pero yung kasi yung sabi ng batas.
Yan ang sabi ng batas. Okay, so kapag kayo umutang kayo, nangungutang kayo at sinabi niya ba, alam mo yung
it's dangerous kung walang period. So, kung magpapautang kayo, kailangan definite yung period na sasabihin. Kasi kung walang period, at sasabihin lang siya, ibabalik ko naman kapag ako yung may pera na, kailan? Mahirap.
Halimbawa ito, Attorney, I don't know kung na-experience mo ito, pero ako madalas ko ito na-experience. Halimbawa, alam mo yun, pag halimbawa kumakain kayo, kumakain kayo with your friends, tapos sasabihin ng friends mo, kung mo na magbayad at buong pera ko. Babayaran ko na lang, pag may, may barya na ako. How would you consider that kind of obligation?
That kind of obligation.
Is that an obligation with a period? Kasi sinabi ko,
Oo, kasi babayadan, sabi niya magbabayad siya pag nagkabariya. So, intayin mong magkakasama kayo, intayin mo kailan magpapabariya, tapos singilin mo.
That's a with a period.
With a period.
Demandable pa.
Oo, pero pag sinabi niya na
scammer pala.
Libre, ayun ang hindi talaga.
Kaya pag kayo guys, tinanong kayo na, uy, kung muna magbayad at wala akong barya, tanungin nyo, ano ga to? Nagpapalibre ka? Or is this an obligation with a period? Would I consider this as an obligation with a period?
Oo.
Tatandaan nyo yun na. Marami tayong mga scammer friends. I'm just kidding. Alright, so take note of Article 1180 of the New Civil Code. How about Article 1180 mo na?
Yes. Article 1181, in conditional obligations, the acquisition of rights as well as the extinguishment or loss of those already acquired shall depend upon the happening of the event which constitutes the condition.
So, ang pinag-usapan dito is
so, ito naman yung effects of happening of the condition.
Ano ba ang effect kapag nangyari ang condition? So,
Dalawa yan.
Dalawa.
Yan yung sinabi natin kanina. Una, mag-acquire ng rights or acquisition of rights. Pangalawa, it will also result to the loss of the rights already acquired.
So, in short, ito lang yung sinasabi natin.
Suspensive
or resolutory.
Depende kung ano bang condition.
Pag suspensive, nangyari yung condition, mag-acquire ka ng right. Halimbawa, sinabi natin kanina na I will give her 10,000 pesos if April Uy would pass the 2021 bar examinations. So kapag dumating yung 2021 bar examinations at pumasa siya, ibig sabihin mag-a-acquire siya ngayon ng karapatan, ng right. At ano yung karapatan niya? Demand from me the amount of 10,000 pesos. Ayan. As contrary naman dun sa example natin kanina na I promised to support her, give her monthly allowances in the amount of 10,000 pesos until she graduates in college. Kapag siya ay nakagraduate na, malulost na niya yung rights
Yes.
already acquired. Ano yung already acquired rights niya? To receive 10,000 pesos
Yes.
monthly
Correct.
from allowances na magagaling sa akin. Pero pag nangyari na nga yung condition, nakagraduate siya, mawawala na yung mawawala na yung rights already acquired ni Attorney Uy. Okay.
Correct. Now, let's proceed to Article 1182.
And Article 1182, take note that it says, when the fulfillment of the condition depends upon the sole will of the debtor, the conditional obligation shall be
Yan.
void.
Oo.
If it depends upon chance or upon the will of a third person, the obligation shall take effect in conformity with the provisions of this code. Alright? So, dito actually, we have to define a technical or legal term na meron tayo. This is
Yes.
what we call the potestative condition.
Condition.
Ano ba itong potestative condition,
So,
Attorney?
a potestative condition is a condition suspensive in nature and which depends upon the sole will of one of the contracting parties.
Alright, take note, it's a
Oo.
condition, specifically suspensive ang nature
so
niya.
it is a suspensive condition and which depends upon the sole will of one of the contracting parties. So it is a suspensive condition which may depend upon the will of the debtor or a suspensive condition which may depend upon the will of the creditor. Kasi either one.
So the curious question that we have here, Attorney Uy, is what if the suspensive condition depends upon the will of the debtor?
Yes.
Would that mean that the same conditional obligation is automatically void?
So, ang sabi dun sa first sentence ng Article 1182, when the fulfillment of the condition depends upon the sole will of the debtor, the conditional obligations shall be void.
Kasi in this case, yung mismong conditional obligation na yung yung fulfillment, na mismo.
Unlike kanina, duration yon.
Mhm.
Sure na magbabayad, pero yung duration of the period, yun lang ang depending on the will of the debtor. Pero ito ngayong 1182, ang nagde-depend na sa will ng debtor ay yung fulfillment of the very obligation itself.
And
So sabi, void
yes,
daw yun.
yes. Because in this case, again, sabi natin, where the potestative condition depends solely upon the will of the debtor, then the conditional obligation shall be void because its validity and compliance is left to the will of the debtor.
Yes.
And it cannot therefore be legally demanded. Kasi
Correct.
how would I legally demand it kung ang usapan nga namin nakadepende doon sa debtor yung fulfillment of the
Oo, kasi kung
obligation itself.
nakadepende sa debtor yung fulfillment ng obligation, ang sasabihin lang ni debtor, I will not fulfill it anymore. Because the debtor is always interested na hindi na ma-fulfill yung obligation para wala na siyang obligation. So, illusory yung obligation.
That's true. But however, if you want to have another view on this, kasi this interpretation of the law is somehow disputed, and there is a perspective coming from, of course, Manresa himself, a definition of what exclusive or yung soul, term na soul na ginamit dyan, no? And yun, para nga sa kanya is that this it doesn't necessarily mean that the conditional obligation will be void, no?
Oo.
Pero marami even legal luminaries would use even the reference book that we have, the Book of De Leon, would consider the same as void.
Oo, void. Ang ibig sabihin ng conditional obligation is void, it means that the condition is void and the obligation is likewise void.
In this
Yun ang
case.
ibig sabihin nun ha.
Anong reason ulit kung bakit siya magiging void? Kasi nga, the fulfillment of the obligation is...
Depends upon
Yes, depends upon the soul
will of
exclusive
the
will
debtor.
of the debtor. Alright. So, example, para
Yan.
malinawan ng mga bata na nakikinig ngayon. Halimbawa, sinabi ko kay Attorney Uy, can I borrow 1,000 pesos from you and I will pay it if I want? Babayaran ko kung gusto ko.
Wow.
Wow, wow. So, in that case, the same is considered as a conditional obligation, the fulfillment
Of which
solely
depends
depends upon the will of the debtor.
debtor.
In my case, it's me, and therefore, it cannot be legally demanded by Attorney Uy, and therefore, the conditional
Kasi
obligation
walang
is-
period.
Yes, wala.
Kailan ba niya gugustuhin na magbayad sa akin? Hindi ko alam. Siyempre, hindi siya interesado magbayad.
Okay, at hindi siya papatak sa Article
Oo.
1181. Kasi sa
Oo.
Article 1181, sinabi naman
May
ng debtor
duration.
na I will pay you when my means permit
Me to
permit
do
me to do
so.
so.
Oo.
May
intention to
intention to
pay.
pay. Dito, I will pay you if I want pag gusto ko lang.
Oo.
Paano kung hindi niya nga gusto?
Gusto, kaya nga. At normally, hindi niya talaga gusto.
Hindi mo gusto yun.
Oo, ng utang. So, I will pay you after I receive a loan from the bank. So, dito, the condition again depends upon the sole will of the debtor. So, paano kung hindi ka mag-apply ng loan sa bank, di hindi ka magbabayad sa akin?
Yes.
Hindi, it depends upon your sole will na naman. So, hindi.
Isa pa, I will pay you after I recover what the debtor owes me, or magbabayad ako kay attorney kapag binayaran ako ng kapag naka-recover ako from my own debtor. Paano nga kung hindi ako mag-recover? So, hindi na mapufulfill yung obligation ko kay attorney. And again, it's absurd and illusory. So, it's void. Okay? Now, yung second dyan is that, kanina sabi natin, pag ganun yung pangyayari, yung conditional obligation mismo ay void. The condition is void, the obligation is void.
Pero meron din pala na instance na only the condition is void, tapos valid pa rin yung obligation. Kailan yun, Attorney?
Well, in this case, if the obligation is a pre-existing one and therefore does not depend for its existence upon the fulfillment by the debtor of the potestative condition, only the condition is void, leaving unaffected the obligation itself. Here, the condition is imposed not on the birth of the obligation, but on its fulfillment. So, it presupposes
parang may afterthought na lang. So,
Yes.
may pre-existing obligation, tapos yung condition, in-impose mo na lang as a mere afterthought.
Yes, okay. So, in that case, valid pa rin yung obligation. Ang void lang
Only
yan ay
yung condition.
So,
For example,
yes.
yung si debtor borrowed 10,000 pesos from creditor which is payable within 2 months. Subsequently, the debtor promised to pay the creditor after the debtor sells his car, to which the creditor agreed. In this case, only the condition is void, but the pre-existing obligation of the debtor to pay the creditor remains valid.
So what happened in this case, guys, is there is a pre-existing obligation, and the obligation is that, of course, to pay 10,000 pesos payable in 2 months. So may period na provided in the original. Subsequently, however, yung parties...
So valid naman talaga yun.
Yes, and that's valid.
For example, yung 10,000 daw babayaran niya within 2 months, valid yun.
Valid obligation. However, subsequently nga, nagkaroon ng understanding na, hindi, instead na ganun, babayaran ko na lang kapag naibenta ko yung sasakyan na meron ako. And there lies the problem when it comes to the condition imposed. Kasi ang condition na binigay ko is, I'll be paying you if
within 2 months.
Yes, I'll be paying you if I'm able to sell if I'm able to sell my car.
Your car.
So,
paano kung hindi niya mabenta?
so,
edi wala.
Hindi na magbabayad, hindi na legally demandable. So, in that case, sabi ng batas,
the condition is void because it depends upon the sole will of the debtor. Pero, yung obligation is existing. The pre-existing obligation is valid.
And therefore, si debtor would still be legally demanded to pay the amount of 10,000 pesos in that case. Okay, according to their pre-existing obligation. Now, where suspensive condition depends upon the will of the creditor, ano naman ang effect nito? So, yung foregoing discussions natin about...
Yung kanina is a potestative condition which depends upon the sole will of the debtor. Ito naman yung suspensive condition which depends upon the will of the creditor. So sabi naman dito, valid daw yun.
Because again, if the condition depends exclusively upon the will of the creditor, the obligation is valid. Kasi guys, ang ang wisdom behind this is that the creditor is
always
interested in the fulfillment of the obligation. Kasi kung ikaw may pautang, the law presumes that as a creditor, you want the fulfillment of the obligation.
Yes.
Contrary to dun sa point ng debtor, from the perspective of law, na naturally inclined ang debtor not to pay. Diba? Yung sinasabi niya. Kaya kapag sole will ng debtor, yan, dyan may pagka-void.
At ulitin ko ulit, dalawang void yun. Pwedeng conditional obligation is void at pwedeng yung condition lamang ang void. So, ang example nito, babayaran ko si Attorney Maralit kapag nag-demand na siya or upon his demand. I will pay my indebtedness to Attorney Meralit upon his demand. Eh di ba valid yun? Eh alangan lang, hindi ka magbayad.
Take note na the fulfillment depends on the sole will of me as a creditor kasi kung magde-demand ako and that is valid daw kasi as a creditor, of course, I'm naturally inclined to demand from attorney with the payment of the amount or the obligation or the amount I've extended to her. Okay? Now, what if naman resolutory condition naman yung nakadepende naman sa will of the debtor?
O kanina, suspensive, depends upon sole will of the debtor, void. Ito naman, suspensive, sole will of the creditor, valid. Ito naman, resolutory condition depending upon the will of the debtor.
Ano naman
sabi
ang rule dyan?
Valid pa rin.
Kasi if the condition is resolutory in nature, like the right to repurchase in a sale with pacta de retro.
Yung right to repurchase.
Yes, the obligation is valid although its fulfillment depends upon the sole will of the debtor.
Yes, please take note of that. Yung mga difference ng suspensive, tapos resolutory, tas upon the will of the debtor, upon the will of the creditor.
Kasi in this case, the fulfillment of the condition merely causes the extinguishment or loss of rights already acquired, and the debtor is naturally interested in its fulfillment in this case. Kasi as a debtor, he or she would like to repurchase yung kung ano yung nangyaring sale.
Kung ano yung, for example, yung pinagbili niya, ma-repurchase pa rin niya.
Naturally inclined siya to do that. Okay? Because in this case, the position of the debtor when the condition is resolutory is exactly the same as that of the creditor when the condition is suspensive. Nagkakapalit. Okay. So, puntahan natin yung tinatawag na casual condition. Ano ba yung casual condition, attorney?
If the suspensive condition depends upon chance or upon the will of a third person, the obligation subject to it is valid.
So yung kanina
Or
depends upon the sole will of the debtor or the creditor. Ngayon naman depends upon chance.
Pwedeng chance
or upon the will of a third person. The obligation daw is valid. Sige, bigyan natin ng example, attorney, para maintindihan ng mga viewers natin.
Yes. If a building contractor obliges himself in favor of the building owner to repair at the building contractor's expense any damage that may be caused to the building by any earthquake occurring within 10 years from the date of the completion of its construction. O, ano yan? So, may building contractor, sabi ni building contractor, he obliges himself to repair yung building ni owner.
Oo, kung halimbawa na nasira yung building ni owner because of an earthquake, then the building
within 10 years.
Yes, the building contractor would make himself liable daw for the expenses in its repair. So ano yung doon? Ano yung casual condition doon?
Casual condition yung
the happening
the chance.
Or the
upon
chance.
Alin doon yung chance? Eh di kapag nag-earthquake within 10 years from the time
And
of the
suspensive
completion
condition yun kasi kapag nangyari yung chance na yun or yung earthquake na yun, it will give rise to an obligation to repair on the part of the building contractor, and that is valid. For example, si seller, he binds himself to sell a parcel of land to a certain buyer in a condition that yung existing or yung case na meron si seller pending before the Supreme Court ay magproprosper. Ibig sabihin, halimbawa, yung lupa in dispute nasa korte. Sabi niya, kapag ako ay nanalo pare dito sa dispute sa lupa, sa pinaglalaban kong itong sa korte, ibebenta ko sa iyo. Okay? So take note guys na there is a casual condition there. And the casual condition is what?
Upon the will of a third person.
On the will of a third person.
Pwede din upon chance. Kasi chance. Pero hindi chance din yung pagkakapanalo mo.
Yes.
Upon the will of a third person, then pwedeng magaling yung lawyer niya. Pwede din sa Supreme Court. Siyempre, Supreme Court mag-decide.
So, pag nag-decide, let's say, ang Supreme Court na manalo or talagang ma-award sa kanya yung lupa, then si seller would have an obligation to sell his promised land to that buyer kung saan niya pinaaral.
Promise. Kanaan.
Okay, pinamis naman talaga niya.
Oo, totoo.
Promise land. Okay. Alright, so Okay, napapag-usapan na natin guys yung iba't ibang uri ng condition.
Condition.
May pumasok mo na casual condition. Ngayon, pag-usapan naman natin yung tinatawag na mixed condition. Okay.
Mixed siya kasi the obligation is valid if the suspensive condition depends partly upon chance and upon the will of a third person. So ito may concurrence ng will or may concurrence ng chance at saka ng will of a third person. Kanina or. Ngayon ito and.
So, kailangan mag-concur pareho yung
Chance.
at saka yung will of a third person. So, bigyan natin ng kaliwanagan yan para mas mabigyan natin ng shed light to the viewers. Halimbawa, yung example kanina, halimbawa, si building contractor, inoblige niya yung sarili niya to pay, in favor of the building owner, to repair at his own expense whatever damage na magti-take place dun sa building nung owner. Provided that yung reason for the damage is the earthquake, and further provided na merong arbitrators or
merong decision
na manggagaling sa panel of arbitrators na magpo-prove na kaya talaga nasira yung building, it's because of the earthquake.
Yes.
So, take note na dalawa yung condition na pumasok. Una, dapat because yung defect or yung damage dahil sa earthquake. Pangalawa,
may judgment or decision from the panel of arbitrators.
Technical people na talagang dahil sa earthquake.
Na dahil sa earthquake kaya na-damage. So, yung upon chance yung earthquake and yung panel of arbitrators, yan yung third person. So, dapat pareha sila. Kaya mix.
And in that case, sabi natin, that's a mixed condition, and both conditions must take place in order that the building contractor's obligation will
repair will arise.
So, yun yung mixed condition na sinasabi.